If a company cannot afford to pay its workers that it needs in order to make its profits a livable wage, that company should not exist. Another way of saying this is that every single worker deserves a livable wage. But because all of you right-wingers are so unoriginal, I dare you to actually watch this to the end before commenting anything about a livable wage. And I'm serious, I will actually be steel-manning y'all's arguments as much as humanly possible in this video, so if you are genuinely wanting to have a conversation about this, then watch the full thing. So without further ado, let's hear what Ben Shapiro himself has to say about a livable wage.
It tends to be that wages move in tandem with costs, generally speaking, because again, there is no such thing as a non-living wage. Nobody dies on their wage. And that is not a thing that happens inside the United States. This is why when people say living wage, the question is, well, what do you mean by a non-living wage? Do you just mean a wage that you don't think is high enough? And for what job? And what does the market look like?
What Ben is doing right now is survivorship bias. Survivorship bias occurs when researchers focus on individuals, groups, or cases that have passed some sort of selection process while ignoring those who did not. What Ben is essentially saying is that because people are still working, clearly they are alive, and so clearly they could not have been receiving an unlivable wage. So not only is Ben completely ignoring the concept of debt, but on top of that, Ben is ignoring all of the workers who didn't show up the next day because an emergency happened and they couldn't afford the healthcare bill. So yeah, I'd say that we have an issue with wages and benefits and healthcare in general in the US when 34 million adults know someone who died after not getting treatment and 58 million adults report inability to pay for needed drugs in the past. And while the CDC doesn't count starvation or malnutrition as its separate category and causes of death, the all other causes include 359,000 deaths. But with a little bit of math, we can figure it out, and that's what they did on this website. So we've got 37 million food insecure people times 0.37 people dying per 1,000 food insecure people gives us about 13,690 people starving to death in America per year. So of course Ben is going to miss the workers who died being unable to afford their health care or being unable to afford food, because he's only looking at workers who are currently receiving a wage. And last I checked, only alive workers were getting paid wages, livable or not. Only alive workers are still going to fucking work. So the ones who couldn't make it on that livable wage are out of Ben's demographic, and he's ignoring the people who are still in the demographic with debt. So now that we heard what Ben Shapiro had to say about a living wage, let's hear what the Foundation for Economic Education has to say about it, considering the fact that they are also a right-wing libertarian think tank thingy.
How can you pay this person anything less than a full-time livable salary when they're working for you? Well, because not every service we might exchange money for requires a full-time salary employee.
My counterpoint to that is pretty obvious, that if you are hiring someone to do that job, then clearly it needs to be done. Regardless of if it's done through a part-time worker or a full-time worker, the hours that they spent doing that work should provide a decent living for that hourly wage. This never really made that much sense to me anyway, because the part-time worker's salary, the reason why it's less than the full-time workers is because they're working less hours. That's how it should be. And I'll go over the specifics in a second when I go into the definition of a living wage. But to be clear, none of us advocating for a living wage are necessarily saying that a part-time worker should make the same as a full-time worker's salary, because we understand that they are not working the same time. What we are saying though is that their wages should both provide for a comfortable living. The wages of the part-time worker and the full-time worker can be the same. If you can't afford a full-time worker, that's fine. You can still hire someone part-time and only pay them for the amount of hours that they worked at a decent wage, but that's still not going to be equivalent to the cost of a full-time worker, because a full-time worker would be working at that wage for much longer because they are a full-time worker. In short, the wage can stay the same. The difference comes from if you are working part-time or if you are working full-time. That is what will determine if you are making enough. But the wage itself of hourly needs to be livable, so that if that part-time worker decides to go full-time, their wage should translate to a full-time livable wage. I hope that this makes sense. If it doesn't, my God, I'll cover it in another video, but Jesus, I think that it's self-explanatory. But to be fair, they address this a little bit in the comics, so let's see what they have to say.
I'm okay with it. Plus, I need some rent money.
Quiet, you! Actually, virtually none of my clients pay me enough to live off of. Most of them can only afford to hire me for a few months out of the year for a fraction of the average salary. But fortunately, I've been able to accumulate enough clients so that my combined earnings are enough to support myself. But if you told each of my clients that because they weren't paying me a full-time salary, they shouldn't be able to hire me, I would never have been able to build my career or pay any of the private contractors I work with. That would be unfair to everyone. Well, I guess that makes sense for part-time work, but a lot of businesses pay low wages to workers who are with them full-time. Well, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, most minimum wage workers are young people working part-time. Only 1% of full-time hourly wage earners make minimum wage or less, compared to...
For starters, I'm not advocating for a living wage due to the small percentage of workers that are still currently working at the federal minimum wage. Because to anyone who's been living in the United States longer than, I don't know, about 5 minutes, is well aware of the fact that there are numerous wages above the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour that still do not pay you enough to survive. To most of us who live paycheck to paycheck, we are well aware of the fact that you need at least 15 in most places or closer to 25 in others in order to be able to afford the basics like housing or healthcare. Now on to the facts of what it means to be for a living wage. I'm gonna be reading these are gonna be more dense, so do not worry, I will be putting a video around here in order for you to stay entertained. Analysts and policymakers often compare income to the federal poverty threshold in order to determine an individual's ability to live within a certain standard of living. However, poverty thresholds do not account for living costs beyond a very basic food budget. The federal poverty measure does not take into consideration costs like childcare and healthcare that not only draw from one's income, but also are determining factors in one's ability to work and to endure the potential hardships associated with balancing employment and other aspects of everyday life. Further, poverty thresholds do not account for geographic variation in the cost of essential household expenses. The living wage model is an alternative measure of basic needs. It is a market-based approach that draws upon geographically specific expenditure data related to a family's likely minimum food, childcare, and health insurance, housing, transportation, and other basic necessities, e.g. clothing, personal care items, etc. costs. Living wage draws on these cost elements and the rough effects of income and payroll tax to determine the minimum employment earnings necessary to meet a family's basic needs while also maintaining self-sufficiency. We're almost there, guys, I swear. The living wage model generates a cost of living estimate that exceeds the federal poverty thresholds. As calculated, the living wage estimate accounts for the basic needs of a family. Conservatives, wake up, pay attention. The living wage model does not include funds that cover what many may consider as necessities enjoyed by many Americans. The tool does not include funds for pre-prepared meals or those eaten in restaurants. We do not add funds for entertainment, nor do we incorporate leisure time for unpaid vacations or holidays. Lastly, the calculated living wage does not provide a financial means to enable savings and investment or for the purchase of capital assets, e.g. provisions for retirement or home purchases. Literally the bare minimum! The living wage is the minimum income standard that, if met, draws a very fine line between the financial independence of the working poor and the need to seek out public assistance or suffer consistent and severe housing and food insecurity. In light of this fact, the living wage is perhaps better defined as a minimum subsistence wage for persons living in the United States. And would you look at that, MIT has a whole page on their methodology if you're curious about it. Now, you can pause and read for yourself, but I ended up using myself as an example, so let's go through it. Now, a lot of you guys may already know this, but I used to work as an EMT in DeKalb County, Georgia, where they are building the facility here in Atlanta, and I used to work as an EMT for $14.50 an hour. This was only last fall, before you guys come and tell me that this was ages ago, and so the wage would have changed. No, this was literally last fall. I stopped working because of healthcare issues. And to be even more specific, I was an advanced EMT who was working part-time because I'm getting my master's right now. But my fellow coworkers who were full-time were making still under $15 an hour, so don't come at me with that. So again, I was working as an advanced EMT doing 911, responding to y'all's emergencies, and I was getting paid $14.50 while my private for-profit EMS agency was raking in billions for their parent company that is KKR, which is a private equity firm. So with all of that in mind, $14.50 for 911, what do you think is a living wage in order to just meet the bare minimum in DeKalb County, Georgia? Again, I was making $14.50 an hour. Would you look at that? Would you look at that? I would have needed $4 to $5 more an hour in order to meet what is considered the bare minimum. The bare minimum of food and shelter without having to go to government programs. This doesn't even include the basic luxuries that most people in the wealthiest country that the world has ever seen should be able to have, such as going out to a goddamn fucking restaurant once a week. Not to mention that I wouldn't be able to put a penny towards retirement or towards bettering my situation. Now, here's where it also gets interesting for someone like me. I'm not gonna name which one. If you've been following me for a while, then you can probably figure out which one of these drugs I take, but I have to take one of these. And my insurance doesn't cover it. Now, I'm currently in a program for a few months where I'm getting it for free, but that eventually will end. This is just one of my medications. Another one costs $850 a month. Out of pocket. Again, insurance refusing to cover it. These are prescriptions that my doctors say I need in order to be a functional member of society. How do you suggest that I afford any of these medications monthly that I need when 1 month of that medication costs more than what this living wage calculator is giving me a budget for all of my food? food. 1 month of my medication costs as much as the living wage calculator is giving me for my food. But according to Ben, I don't exist because I'm not dead. So clearly I wasn't getting paid under a living wage because I haven't died yet. But I'll be transparent with y'all, I don't care. The only reason why I'm still alive, and have a roof over my head is because I am privileged. It's because both of my parents were doctors, and so they can afford to help me as I cannot work because I cannot afford the medications that my literal doctors prescribed me. And that's not to say that it would have happened immediately. It would have probably been a slow fall through the giant gaping holes that exist in the United States social safety net. But the outcome is still the same. I, as a part-time worker who is still part-time a student, would have been unable to afford the basic necessities if it hadn't been for my parents. And a lot of people don't have that. The majority of people do not have what I have. The majority of people just end up crippled in debt. And don't get me wrong, I still get my medical bills. I still have debt coming my way. My parents won't be here for forever. But do not tell me that there is no such thing as living wage. Don't. You're just gonna look stupid.